ideas. In this edition, we are having a new format for the event in which we bring doctoral students and professors from different parts of the world. It is an event that is organized in a partnership by POSAFRO, the Anthropology Department of the Federal University of Bahia, the State University of Campinas, and the African Multiple Cluster of Excellence at Bairro. I would like to thank you. It also counts on the support of the Cape Verde University, the association, the National Association for Graduate Studies, and the Brazilian Society of Sociology. And it's been translated by Raquel Luciana de Souza. In French, we have the collaboration of Felipe Fernandes. Thank you so much. I would like to thank you also, those who are following us online. It's necessary that you have 75% percentage of attendance. You may ask questions using the chat box so that our professors may then provide you with answers. Today, our program will bring the topic necropolitic with the professor from Fiocruz, Robert Wagner, Jacobo Banson from Burkina Faso, building this event also we have the presence of so we are here thinking about this drastic moment in which we are going through.
estágio pós-doutoral no Instituto de Estudos Africanos da Universidade de Leipzig, na Alemanha, e suas intervenções acadêmicas enfocam prioritariamente, algumas vezes em perspectiva cruzada e comparada, o Maranhão no Brasil e a África do Sul, mas também em Moçambique, na África Austral, e atua na formação de professores e estudantes da educação básica para ênfase na história e cultura africana, afro-brasileira e indígena, a partir do Núcleo de Estudos e Pesquisa e Extensão sobre África e o Sul Global, UNEAfrica, que é uma parceria da UFMA, da UEMA e da UESP, no grupo de pesquisa do qual ele também é membro fundador. Ele também compõe a coordenação da Fábrica de Ideias. Bem-vindo, professor.
E aí, pessoalmente, de maneira remota, né? Professor Ilcuba Banhoro, professor Robert Wegner. Então, bom dia a todos, e como disse Lívia em outras lives e outros colegas, boa tarde, né? Para quem está no boa tarde, boa noite também, para quem está porventura, né? No momento de noite aí nos seus locais, né? Eu estou aqui a 2 graus ao sul do Equador, na ilha de São Luís do Maranhão, no extremo norte aqui, nordeste do Brasil, né? Então, bem-vindos a todos. Então, a gente dá continuidade hoje à nossa 22ª Escola Doutoral Fábrica de Ideias, né? E que está no seu segundo ciclo de lives, né? E a live de hoje, como nós já divulgamos, tem como tema, diria, um tema gerador, algo extremamente relevante no contexto efetivamente atual: eugenia, biopoder, racismo,
eugenics, power, racism, and necropolitics. I would like to thank William for the brief presentation of the curriculum. And Professor Robert, I would like to evince some key elements that I think will be helpful in locating what has been said by professors. First of all, allow me, Professor Wagner, to inform that you are both specialists, you are researchers, and when we observe a bit of the history of your work, we realize that we've been dealing clearly with issues and problems that constitute the central theme of the debate for this course. So Professor Wagner, since 1999, has been a researcher at Fiocruz, and Professor Yucupa Banhoro at the University of Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso, two perspectives of the South of Global South. And Professor Wagner, we already know him in Brazil. He has a book that is about Sérgio Buarque de Holanda, and his doctoral thesis that was published in 2000, a thesis that he's defended at UERJ. In fact, I would like to state that Professor Wagner has been developing research in fields that I think are intersected with social sciences and health, and it has concerns with nations and intellectuals. And when I read some texts about this, is the history of medicine and disease, and particularly the eugenics moment, I think that in the context where we live currently, this is particularly relevant. We are now thinking here in Brazil about the CPI COVID-19, in which we people, members of the current government, are being invited to make statements and provide clarifications about the management of the pandemic. So, therefore, the articles and his interventions may have as a point of departure how the Brazilian government has behaved. And we all know that vis-a-vis national and international press, a context that has, it's a context of tragedies, particularly affecting those who are more vulnerable in our context. So what we have then is a debate, for example, around the existence of an eugenics project in terms of the practices and the ideas of public authorities, particularly our federal government. And in that sense, it seems to be healthy and necessary to evince that historically these notions of eugenics are not issues of local, but that are part of projects coming from countries in the north. So this Brazilian eugenics, therefore, should be placed within a broader scope. Eugenics, power, and racism. And we have here also Professor Yucuba Banhura. He's 3 hours ahead of us in Burkina Faso, as has stated, at Ouagadougou University. In fact, I would say that
professor Banhoro nos leva a algumas reflexões. Um dos trabalhos que o professor realizou, né, realizou vários estudos sobre o surgimento.
Desculpa, Evaldo, deixa interromper. Raquel, tem que mudar de canal. Ok. Yacuba, you can have the translation if you have the channel, if you put in English. When it says translate, we'll need a traduction en bas. Au côté des records, tu peux mettre anglais et tu peux écouter la traduction en anglais. OK? Juste en bas, à la droite. Desculpa, Evaldo, interromper, mas não há outro jeito a não ser esse jeito chato.
Tranquilamente.
Continua.
Então,
muito obrigado, Evaldo.
Eu que agradeço, Lívio. Muito obrigado. Então, caminhando...
Hence, we are moving towards Professor Yacuba, who's been organizing several studies about HIV/AIDS, and it's interesting that in his studies that are available to the students, I see that he has elaborated it in evincing that this phenomena, there is a proliferation of multilateral institutions and private institutions. As we know, the organizations of the Global Fund Against AIDS, but he observes that these institutions emerge in the context of globalization, and it incorporates a change in health paradigms on a global scale, meaning that it seeks to deepen in broad senses, meaning that rich capitalist countries were able to project themselves through these health institutions, which means that we have a neoliberal globalization through the healthcare system in which the capitalism is once again dictating the rules of capitalism in terms of pharmaceuticals and the pharmaceutical practices, particularly in Burkina Faso. And today he's going to bring us a reflection from a historical perspective about the order of in face of the pandemics COVID-19. I thank you. And I would like to start with Professor Yacuba.
Correct.
Ok, allô? Vous m'entendez?
Oui, oui.
Ok, d'accord.
Très bien, Yacuba, ça marche très bien, merci.
D'accord. Donc, je vais commencer. Je voudrais tout d'abord vous remercier beaucoup de m'avoir invité à cette fabrique des idées. Mes remerciements vont au professeur Livio Samson et à tous ses collègues qui co-organisent cet événement. Je suis Yacuba Banhura et je suis historien de l'Université Joseph Kizerbo de Ouagadougou. Donc, je vais parler de l'ordre sanitaire global face à la pandémie de COVID-19. Je suis en train de chercher à mettre mon chrono pour que je puisse m'arrêter à temps, si vous permettez. Voilà. Donc, en introduction, je voudrais dire que l'histoire contemporaine des changements dans la gouvernance sanitaire mondiale suggère que le monde devait être mieux préparé pour contrer efficacement une nouvelle pandémie. Et pourquoi cela? Parce que l'OMS, qui avait cette charge, a été réformée et certaines de ses fonctions traditionnelles furent transférées à d'autres entités comme Gavi, le Fonds mondial, l'ONU-SIDA, etc. Ces changements se sont déroulés dans le cadre de la santé globale, née à la suite de la santé internationale. L'apparition et l'expansion de la COVID-19 peuvent être interprétés comme des événements qui testent la nouvelle gouvernance sanitaire globale. Ici, pour moi, il s'agit surtout de mener une approche critique de la gouvernance sanitaire globale confrontée à la pandémie de COVID-19. Donc, dans mon plan de présentation, j'aurai en grand 1 la mondialisation, la santé internationale et la santé globale. Quelques réflexions théoriques. En grand 2, je vais parler des manifestations de la santé globale dans la gestion de COVID-19.
I am going to talk about the manifestations of global health in the context of COVID-19.
Et les défis que cela pose. Donc, dans la première
and everything that is placed, that takes place in this context. In the first part,
donc, qu'est-ce que c'est que la santé globale et la gouvernance sanitaire globale? Et la
what
notion,
is global health and global
la
vigilance,
notion
health
de
vigilance?
globalisation ou mondialisation aide à mieux comprendre la santé globale. Parce que la
This
globalisation,
notion of globalization and mondialization,
on peut définir la globalisation comme une dynamique d'intégration des peuples, des marchés et des gouvernements à l'échelle globale. On peut,
we may define this globalization as an articulation of among several institutions and people on a global level.
on peut la définir aussi comme un processus de substitution d'un système de réseaux transnationaux aux relations internationales traditionnelles.
And we may define it also as a system in which there is a replacement of the state of the placement of a transnational global network.
Donc, la santé globale se conforme au caractère transfrontalier de la globalisation. Et
Then, global health has to do with this character of borders of globalization.
il y a plusieurs définitions qu'on peut avoir par rapport à la santé globale, mais je vais juste retenir une définition ici. C'est un ensemble de mouvements transfrontaliers de personnes, de biens, de services, de technologies et d'idées qui ont des impacts sur les décisions de la santé.
Then we may have multiple definitions of global health, which are movements of technologies and people, etc.
Donc, deuxièmement, la santé internationale ou la gouvernance sanitaire internationale. Donc là, il s'agit de relations sur des questions de santé des pays, souvent à travers des organisations internationales.
Then I'm going to talk about governance in health, which has to do with the decisions that countries are going to take.
Et donc, si on se réfère à l'histoire, on voit qu'il y avait, depuis le 19e siècle jusqu'en 1946, beaucoup d'organisations dans différentes parties du monde qui essayaient de régir les questions de santé qui intéressaient les États.
If we were to think about this history, particularly in the 19th century, many organizations in different parts of the world, they have been defining health.
L'OMS est une organisation sanitaire à l'échelle globale et elle a été l'héritière pratiquement, de mon point de vue, de l'ensemble de ces organisations et elle est la meilleure représentation de la santé internationale parce qu'elle est régie par ce qu'on appelle l'intergouvernementalisme.
The World Health Organization is an excellent representative on these organizations on a global scale, and it's an important representative because it
Donc, maintenant, dans quel contexte est apparue la santé globale?
In what context do we have global health?
La santé globale est apparue de l'accélération de la globalisation économique et financière, qu'on appelle en français la mondialisation, à la fin de la guerre froide, notamment après la chute du mur de Berlin.
Global health then emerges in the times of an acceleration of a globalization, particularly in the context of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Et donc, elle se passe également dans le contexte des désaccords ou des conflits au sein des Nations Unies, particulièrement au sein de l'OMS, à propos des soins de santé primaires d'Alma-Ata, ou encore des programmes verticaux contre les programmes horizontaux.
And the OMS, the notion of a global health in this context emerges particularly in the context of the United Nations.
Et ça se passe dans le contexte des critiques de l'OMS dans sa gestion de la lutte contre le VIH-Sida entre 1986 et 1988. Donc,
and the OMS is an institution that emerges within the context of the HIV crisis between 1996 and 1986.
Je dis que la santé globale apparaît dans le contexte des critiques de l'OMS. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a des acteurs, de grands acteurs qui ont critiqué l'OMS, qui ont critiqué la gestion du VIH-Sida par l'OMS et qui ont remis en cause la manière dont l'OMS a géré le VIH-Sida. Donc, ça a été un contexte qui a entraîné justement l'émergence de la santé globale.
Ele está apresentando uma correção. So this notion of global health emerges out of the critique in terms of how the OMS has managed the HIV/AIDS crisis.
Et maintenant, la santé globale, on peut la caractériser. On peut la caractériser à travers un certain nombre d'éléments. La première
And now we are
caractéristique,
going to characterize what is global, which is stated or crafted through a number of elements.
Donc, un des éléments, c'est l'apparition de nouveaux acteurs, en plus de l'OMS.
And one of these elements is the emergence of new actors beyond OMS or the World Health Organization, WHO.
On voit que parmi ces acteurs, il y a des acteurs qui n'étaient pas des acteurs spécialisés dans la santé, comme la Banque mondiale, qui interviennent de plus en plus dans la santé, et notamment à partir des années 90. Et nous avons également l'ONU.
And amongst these actors that emerge, not all of them are specialists in global health. As an example,
donc, nous avons l'ONU-SIDA également, qui est né en 1996, justement, de la critique de l'OMS. Et si on prend l'ONU-SIDA, c'est pratiquement une institution dont les prérogatives étaient gérées par l'OMS à l'intérieur de l'OMS.
So, for example, we have the emergence of this critique of the OMS, but it's an institute which prerogative is to manage within the context of the World Health Organization.
Donc, nous avons également Gavi qui, si on regarde l'histoire de l'OMS, était un programme qu'on appelait le programme élargi de vaccination à l'intérieur de l'OMS et que la Banque mondiale et puis Bill et Melinda Gates ont promu pour créer une alliance qu'on appelle l'Alliance Gavi en 1998.
And we also have another example, which is an institution, a program for vaccination that was managed through an alliance that emerges in 1988, a vaccine alliance program.
Donc, une autre caractéristique, je ne vais pas citer toutes les organisations qui sont nées comme nouveaux acteurs, mais je vais aller à la prochaine caractéristique qui est la réduction de l'intergouvernementalisme à travers de nouveaux statuts juridiques.
I'm going to talk about another characteristic now that involves new actors, which is the reduction of intergovernmentalism or intergovernmental relationships.
Donc, ici, nous avons, avec la santé globale, des acteurs des organisations multilatérales et transnationales qui traitent avec des États, directement avec des ONG nationales, internationales, avec des associations nationales et internationales, et contrairement à l'Organisation mondiale de la santé qui traite avec les États.
Hence, we are going to talk about multilateral transnational organizations involving states, NGOs, international and national associations that are working against the OMS or the World Health Organization.
Et nous avons également comme caractéristique que les nouveaux acteurs de la santé globale sont plus favorables aux programmes verticaux qu'aux programmes horizontaux. Et les programmes horizontaux sont des programmes de renforcement des systèmes de santé. Et les programmes verticaux sont des programmes axés sur la résolution d'un problème de santé ou une maladie, par exemple.
So equally, these new actors are more favorable to vertical programs rather than horizontal programs.
Et en plus, ces nouvelles organisations fonctionnent sur la base du partenariat public-privé. Donc, ce qui est pour moi le symbole du néolibéralisme dans la gestion de la santé globale.
And these new actors then they act through partnerships between public and private institutions, which is a central characteristics of neoliberalism within the management of global health.
Donc, une des caractéristiques, la dernière dont je vais parler, c'est le défaut, le manque de structure de coordination des acteurs au niveau international. Il y a beaucoup d'acteurs, mais il n'y a pas de structure de coordination. Et ces acteurs sont également dans beaucoup de régions du monde. Il n'y a pas de coordination non plus et sont également à l'intérieur des États. Et là également, il n'y a pas de coordination ou du moins il n'y a pas de structure supranationale. Et c'est l'OMS qui essaie surtout d'assurer le leadership de ces organisations-là à l'intérieur plutôt des États.
In development, this has produced the development of actors that do not have a structure on the national level. So these organizations are then managed on a different level by the OMS.
Donc ici, j'ai fait un schéma pour juste montrer que entre à partir de 1990, il y a de nouveaux acteurs qui apparaissent dans la santé globale. Mais vous ne voyez pas le schéma, mais à partir de 1990, on constate l'apparition de nombreux acteurs.
Hence, I trace this path, particularly talking about the 1990s, to show how new actors emerge in this context of global health. You won't be able to see it clearly yet, but that's what I have done.
Donc, ici, nous avons essayé de définir la santé globale et de définir le contexte d'apparition de la santé globale, de la gouvernance globale et de donner les caractéristiques de la santé globale. Maintenant, dans la deuxième partie, nous allons voir les manifestations de la santé globale dans la gestion de la COVID-19 et les défis que cela pose.
Then I have tried to define global health and the governance of the global health. And that right now, as I speak, I would like to talk about how global health is manifested in the management of COVID-19.
Donc, je vais prendre quelques éléments pour illustrer mes propos. Donc, la première manifestation dont je parle de la santé globale dans la gestion de COVID-19, c'est que la santé globale s'est surtout manifestée à travers l'association de l'OMS et de Gavi dans la gestion de COVID-19.
So the first manifestations of global health in COVID-19 in global health has been particularly evinced through the mismanagement by WHO.
Non, en fait, je veux dire que la santé globale s'est plutôt manifestée dans la gestion de COVID-19 à travers l'OMS et Gavi qui se sont associés pour lutter contre COVID-19. Ça, c'est un élément de la santé globale dans justement la lutte contre COVID-19.
So what I meant is that the global health has then manifested through COVID-19 in an association between Gavi and the WHO. They have associated in order to manage COVID-19. They have formed a partnership, in other words.
Yes. Et donc, l'OMS a réussi à constituer un partenariat pour fournir les tests, les traitements et les vaccins, ce qu'on appelle le COVAX.
Then OMS was able to guarantee a partnership in order to manage testing, vaccination, and the treatment. And this is what we call co-test. Testing,
COVAX.
vaccination,
COVAX.
and treatment.
COVAX.
COVAX.
Yeah. So,
The COVAX.
COVAX. Yeah. Et Gavi, malgré sa spécialisation dans la promotion et la distribution des vaccins aux enfants, est la mieux adaptée dans ce contexte car elle a une expérience dans les achats groupés de vaccins qui font baisser les prix et font fonctionner les firmes pharmaceutiques.
So since they have this a lot of experience in vaccination, they were the ones who were able to lower prices since they have more expertise for this negotiation.
Donc la santé globale s'est également manifestée dans la multiplication des partenariats publics-privés dans la recherche et la fabrication des vaccins anti-Covid. Et un des éléments de la santé globale qui s'est manifesté dans la lutte contre Covid-19, c'est l'anarchie qu'on constate dans l'approvisionnement en vaccins des pays en dehors du cadre de COVAX et qui est une marque de la santé globale. Donc, les acteurs multiples apparus ne sont pas régis au niveau international par un cadre supranational. Maintenant, je vais évoquer les défis posés par Covid-19 à la santé globale. Donc, la plupart des nouveaux acteurs sont trop spécialisés sur le sida. Par exemple, le Fonds mondial, l'ONU-SIDA, le PEPFAR, et peuvent se convertir difficilement à la lutte contre la
COVAX. And the majority of these actors, these global actors in global health, are specialized in HIV, like the ONU-AIDS and the Global Fund.
Et la création de nouvelles structures ou l'apparition de nouvelles fonctions dans des structures existantes de la gouvernance sanitaire globale constitue une fragmentation des rôles de l'OMS et a contribué à son affaiblissement politique et financier.
And this new structure and this new role within the pandemics has promoted the fragmentation of the role of the WHO.
Et cela rend toute action de l'OMS difficile en cas de crise sanitaire.
And that has made the role of the WHO very difficult in the context of this health crisis.
On a vu qu'au début de la COVID, les États-Unis ont retiré leur soutien politique et financier à l'OMS.
We see, for example, in the beginning of the pandemics, that the United States has withdrawn their funding to the institution, to the WHO.
Et nous voyons également que les programmes de santé qui ont été promus dans la santé mondiale ont négligé le renforcement des systèmes de santé, alors qu'aujourd'hui, pour bien administrer les vaccins, il faut des systèmes de santé adaptés. Donc, ce sont des défis qui sont lancés justement à la lutte contre COVID-19.
And we also see that in the beginning, there has been a neglection of strengthening these health programs. And now it needs to be strengthened or created or remodeled.
Donc, finalement, je peux dire qu'on voit des manifestations de la santé globale dans la lutte contre COVID-19, notamment l'émergence de nombreux partenariats publics-privés dans la recherche, dans la fabrication et dans la distribution des vaccins.
Then we see another evincing of the emergence of these partnerships between the public and the private, particularly in research about vaccines.
Et le grand défi qui se pose aujourd'hui, c'est réussir à produire des vaccins et à les distribuer pratiquement dans le monde sur une base égale et équitable pour faire échec à la COVID-19.
And the challenge now is to be able to produce these vaccines, but also distribute it on a global level in equal ways so that these pandemics may be confronted
Donc,
in fair and just ways.
Donc voilà, je vais arrêter mon propos là. Je crois qu'il est presque l'heure. S'il y a des questions, je pourrais éventuellement intervenir.
Then I'm going to interrupt my lecture. I think that if you have any questions, I'm open to answer them. Thank you for your explanation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Obrigada. Agora ficamos com o professor Robert Wagner e depois retomamos com o professor Evaldo.
Now we are going to have Professor Wagner, and we are now waiting for your questions. And welcome and thank you, Professor Robert. So can you hear me well? Good morning to all of you. It is a great joy for me. My name is Robert Wagner. I'm speaking from Rio de Janeiro. And it's a great joy to participate at the Factory of Ideas. And it's a great pleasure to be here with you today, particularly listening to Yacuba Banhoro. It was very good to hear him speak, and it's also a pleasure to be here with Antonio Evaldo, who had a very generous presentation. And I would like to thank immensely for the invitation by my colleague and friend, Livio Sansoni. The theme of my presentation, my class, eugenics and power and racism, I am going to speak a little bit about what draws my attention in the three texts that I have requested, and then I'm going to have this exercise about the continuities of eugenics after the Second World War. Much of what I am going to say has a close relationship with what Yacuba has stated, thinking about Brazil more specifically, but I think it's also a reflection about the impact of neoliberalism in Brazil and in health. In Brazil, the politics, public policies, health policies in Brazil. I'm going to have this debate about the continuities of eugenics and thinking about eugenics, power, and racism, grounded on true characters. The famous eugenics Renato Kell, who was born in 1889 and died in 1974. And also, I am going to talk about a character. Kell died during the military dictatorship. And I'm going to talk about another character that was raised during the military dictatorship. Jair Bolsonaro, who was born in 1955 and who's been the president since 2019. I'm going to read two sentences by these characters in order to start our conversation. First of all, in 1957, Renato Kelm published an article in a newspaper, and he stated the following: you may not combat misery feeding it with donations, but by biosocial nature measures. And in this article, he mentioned India as an example to be followed because there, according to him, they decided to propagate amongst the least favored classes birth control methods in order to reduce birth control or birth rates. In 92, 35 years after the Kell article, and 20 years after his death, Jair, in his first mandate as a federal deputy, asserted the following: we need to adopt rigid birth control policies in Brazil. We may no longer produce discourses. We need to have resources in order to answer to these miserable ones who proliferate all over the nation. And if we look at these two sentences, I think that it consists then in contextualizing you in thinking about the relationship that they have amongst themselves. What are the relationships that we may establish amongst these two characters, Kel and Jair? But before that, I am going to provide you some comments about the texts that are inspiring me for the conversation we had today. Eugenics in Brazil, Vanderlei Sebastião de Souza, and I would like then to state, we may later talk about this text, but I would like to point out to two elements by Vanderlei. The first point that needs to be very clear is that before the Second World War, eugenics was knowledge that had legitimacy in the traditional community, and it was a science that should be applied in nation states. First point. And another element that the context leaves very clear is that the eugenics movement in Brazil was very complex, and particularly since the beginning, the end of the 20s, it has diversified and brought in figures such as Renato Kelm, one of the most well-known eugenics and one of the most radical ones, because he defended the superiority of the white race, considered mixed race people a degenerated being, and he defended extreme measures such as sterilization of people who had diseases and alcoholics and others. The Brazilian government aggregated characters such as the director of the National Museum, for example, the anthropologist Roberto Pinto, who was known by us as a defender and democratizer of education and health policies, aside from being an arduous followers of the equality amongst the races. So the eugenics movement had space for these two figures, but both of them presented themselves as eugenists before the Second World War. So these are the points that I would like to emphasize about the text. Another text that I brought to you is well known by Michel Foucault in our last class, In Defense of Society, that brings the concept of drawing the attention of the context of racism in the state that I considered fundamental in reflecting about eugenics. For Foucault, racism occurs every time you introduce rupture, an hierarchization amongst groups within a population. And once, since the 19th century, power has become biopower in exercising power over a population as a biological entity, this power introduces ruptures to these populations, establishing groups that deserve to die and procreate and those that should die, so that the population as a whole may improve. In that sense, it's important to think about these concepts of racism. And I would state the following, that in that sense, if we talk about biopolitics, eugenics, that has had its peak as an organized movement in over 40 countries in the beginning of the 20th century, it's a typical case of biopolitics and a generator and a recreator of racisms. Eugenics asserted that those who were more apt should procreate more, while the less able would then procreate less, generating then an improvement of representing racism generated by the state. So these are the elements that I would like to evince in Foucault's texts. And I would like to talk about a text that I provided with you by a North American historian, Alexander Stern, in the book, The Eugenics Nation. A book, the second edition was published in 2016. I believe that Alexander Stern is one of the authors that have contributed the most to the renewal of the studies about eugenics, and she has drawn attention to the continuity of eugenics after the World War. And I am going to talk about a chapter that I have not assigned to you, in which she demonstrates that after 1910, North American eugenists created a new type of racism, a new rupture in the population through the dissemination of IQ tests. By applying these mass tests, eugenists established the category of feeble-minded, or those who are mentally deficient. So we are not talking about insane people, but people who had low IQ according to this test. So you see, feeble-minded is a new category created in the 20th century within the eugenics, North American eugenics movement. And aside with the feeble-minded were the target of the sterilization legislation that have been implemented.
E nessa linha, a Stern vai chamar atenção e vai comprovar documentalmente de que em vários desses estados, ela dá o exemplo, ela trabalha profundamente.
She provides the example. She works with the state of California. She shows that the practice of sterilization of mentally feeble-minded people lasted until the 60s, and therefore it came after what is considered the historical limit of eugenics after the Second World War. So these are the first elements that I would like to bring, and I would like to refer to these texts. And in this text that I have provided to you about the frontier in the United States, between the United States and Mexico, there is a history of the racialization in the context of health policies and eugenic politics in the United States. The establishment of the sanitary posts in the frontiers in 1910 was directly linked to the biological differentiations between Mexicans and North Americans, to the extent that in the 1920s, Harry Lothan had realized studies about the degree of degeneration that resulted from racial mixing between Mexicans and North Americans, or Mexicans and North Americans. So Lothan studied these relationships as racial mixing that led to degeneration. And in this chapter, Alexander Stern argues that when the legislation that restricted migration to the United States, this famous law that was approved in 1924 and that had a lot of influence in Brazil, this legislation that restricted immigration was inspired by eugenic thinking, like Charles Davenport and Harry Lothan. These eugenists were not able to include among the populations that should be vetoed access to the United States. They weren't able to include in this legislation Latin Americans in general, Mexicans in particular. So what restricted the entrance of Latin Americans, particularly Mexican Americans, was not the law, was the creation of the wall, the separation, and the police patrolling of the frontiers. And Stern is then going to draw attention that these politics were actually more lasting than immigration laws, and they have consequences in the racialization against foreigners and Mexicans. So in this chapter, Alexander Stern demonstrates that eugenics has impacts that persist beyond it's an organized movement. And the last argument that I would like to bring here that Stern develops in her book about the continuities of eugenics post-war, she states the following, that after the Second World War, as the United States became a global power, a group of eugenists joined their interest in saving and re-equipping, rethinking, and updating eugenics through the means of exporting, modernizing what was led to the third world. So that has resulted in the post-war organizations such as the International Planned Parenthood and the Population Council that was founded in 1948 and 52, organizations that led to family planning and birth control outside of the United States, particularly in impoverished countries or the so-called third world countries. From that point onwards, this last aspect that I have brought, presented by Alexander Stern, we may go back to Robert Kerm in terms of the need of a birth control policy in Brazil, because since the 50s, there is in the international level of debate two related conversations. On one hand, an optimist notion that once the Second World War was overcome, the world was coming through a political and economic development aside or beyond scientific development that was going to bring this era of social well-being. But on the other hand, there was pessimist notions that the world was being put at threat by the populational increases. So these two antagonic ideas were related to theories that stated that it was possible to export social well-being to impoverished countries or countries in development. Wealthy countries then had a decline of death rates thanks to science. But at the same time, these countries lived a decline in birth rates that only education and culture could bring. It was a synonym of education and culture was the decline in birth rates, a consequence. On the other hand, these authors of modernization thought that the countries were also taking advantage and or enjoying this decline in mortality rates through science and international programs. But in these countries, in light of the lack of culture and education, there was no tendency for decreasing birth rates. So underdeveloped countries, therefore, were target of these programs, as mentioned by Kelm. In the 50s, India was a target of these programs in Latin America, African countries, and these countries then were actually the threat of superpopulations that could then ruin what was predicted in the post-war. And then it is in this context of debates that we should understand this need of birth control in Brazil, for birth control in Brazil. At the same time, we may realize that within the process of demographic explosions, we internally in these impoverished countries, the danger came from impoverished classes. These classes not only constituted a social threat, but their growth withdrew the hopes for growth in countries in development. And these modernization theories then said that the country would never grow if there was no growth in the per capita relationship versus birth control rates. So impoverished countries should then have their birth rates controlled. We are here then facing phenomena of racialization. You see that as I read this text, he was far from having any type of interference in public opinion as much as he had in after the Second World War. He continued to publish books, articles, but no big with no real evidence. But it doesn't matter. What matters is that we should realize the fact that he argued that the danger of populational explosion and the need for controlling them proved that eugenics in the first half of the 20th century was correct, though it had been critiqued in the post-war world. It is symptomatic, therefore, in order to confirm how in the 50s, that Kell, in another article, he elected as his favorite actors Gobineau and Malthus. For him, Malthus and Gobineau were more than ever very currently relevant. In the 19th century, he proclaimed the unequal races, and Thomas Malthus alerted us by populational explosions. These authors then were, according to Kell, very current. At the same time, this debate was taking place vis-a-vis the Cold War. So this vicious cycle of poverty, according to modernity theories, in this moment of the Cold War, this vicious cycle that generated high mortality rates could then bring within itself the insatisfactions from these populations, and what would then lead this impoverished population to become trapped by socialism. And it was then how the United States started to look at Brazil, and projects and inducing cultural change were geared towards Brazil, and with them, the programs for birth natality planning and birth control through the means of these institutions that Alexander Stern refers to, North American organizations that sought to control birth control rates, natality rates in impoverished countries within the context of the military dictatorship implemented in 1964. It is exactly in this moment that the International Planned Parenthood Foundation and the Population Council, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation funds projects for family planning in Brazil, and then emerged institutions such as BENFAM, Civil Society for Well-being in Brazil, and also the Center for Research and Children, who was founded in 1975. CEPA Inc. emerged in Rio de Janeiro, linked to the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And this research center was founded by these North American organizations, establishing several spaces in impoverished communities in the city of Rio de Janeiro. And as they assisted women and children, particularly in impoverished areas of the city, in practice, these centers were more and more geared towards sterilization, supposedly through surgeries. CEPA Inc. was a private institution with international North American funding, implementing birth control without the control of the state. In some ways, it emerged. It was the realization of the dream by Renato Kell, who had died in 1974. And the creation of the system, of the healthcare system. And in this context, in 1991, it was created a parliamentary commission, a commission that gathered up federal deputies and senators who were in charge of investigating sterilization without consent in Brazil, particularly for impoverished Black women. The parliamentary commission was organized as when they organized this dimension in which these last decades, there was a big decrease in birth rates in Brazil. Birth rates in Brazil between the 40s and the 50s and the 60s was 6.2, and it went to 5.75, 4.75 in the 80s, and in the 90s, it had decreased to 2.89, a decline that scientists do not see happening in comparison to any other countries in the world, 6.2 to 2.89 in the 90s. At the same time, when it was possible to see that this was not an accident, but it was an outcome of mass sterilization. This parliamentary commission, 45% of the Brazilian women had been sterilized, and the difference between states was brutal. The highest index was in the Northeast and in the North. Maranhão had almost 80% of women who had been sterilized in reproductive ages. Alagoas represented while in the South there were the lowest indexes. In Rio Grande do Sul, it had the lowest index, 22% of women who had been sterilized. Hence, at the same time, and also another element, at the same time, during these debates in the commission, it was clear that in the rural areas, it was linked to the process of privatization of healthcare that predominated during the military dictatorship. Private institutions with external funding and no governmental control. So data then shows that we were facing a policy of death and sterilization on specific groups. It was a racist policy geared towards Black women, racist in terms of social class, a racism of regional character, inequalities, regional inequalities, state inequalities, in a clear and perverse gender violence. Hence, amongst these parliamentary commissions that were composed by 60 federal deputies and senators, Benedita da Silva, federal deputy by Rio, by the Workers' Party in Rio, and Suplicy in São Paulo, and then we had a federal deputy that was in his first mandate, called Jair Bolsonaro. Jair did not have an effective participation in the committee, but it was exactly during the measure that mass sterilization happened in Brazil without consent that then he started to make assertions such as the first one made above. While this committee was in place in 1993, he introduces a legislative proposition in which impoverished people should then go sterilization as a way of birth control. In 2008, he went back to assertions such as, let me repeat his words, it's not enough to talk about education because the majority of people is not prepared to receive education, and it's not going to be educated, or it's not going to educate itself. Only birth control may save us from chaos. This type of discourse, we may then see two fundamental elements. First, we need to have clear that when we consider education as inefficient, since not everybody would be able to be educated, Jair, the deputy, then established a gap between those who deserve to have education and those who don't. With his suggesting then existence of a population that was formed by groups that were hierarchic by nature. The deputy denied the social right of historically constituting education, universal education. And the second characteristic, a bit less explicit, but it's evident if we think about the context that of the crimes of the Parliamentary Commission in 1988. This commission is established after the return to democracy and the citizenship committee. And the discourse by Jair is a manifestation of the despised by a public policy by the SUS, a public policy promoted by the state that would then starting to replace the privatizing logic. So the new policy was substantiated in the public health care system, and his then position, he is providing a critique and to the public health system in a practice that was established by private institutions in a space left by power that had not cared for the healthcare system. There was no proper attention paid to the healthcare system. So Bolsonaro, as he praises sterilization, he's also praising the lack of public policies. So this is the assertion of neoliberalism and the devaluing of public policies. And in conclusion, structurally speaking, it is the same type of stand that is now becoming crystal clear during the pandemics. Ironically, we are going back to a new parliamentary committee for COVID-19. And not to speaking about the resistance to purchasing vaccines and defending inefficient medication. What I would like to emphasize is the critique to social isolation and defending the free circulation of people. And it has become as an awareness choice, meaning that he chose to believe the theory that more and more people should be contaminated so that more quickly COVID-19 would be defended. Osmar Terra, a thesis of herd immunity that the World Health Organization has been qualified by epidemiologists, asserting that only vaccination may have the impact, the necessary impact. I would like then to write down its political meaning. both sides of the coins, they are completed in this thesis of herd immunity. And then in conclusion, one aspect is neoliberalism. It is the refusal of the role of the state and policies in general. As the government did not formulate a policy for combating COVID-19, 1 year after the pandemics, the emergency fund were only adopted because the legislative branch, and in spite of his Ministry of Economy, because for them, economy should continue to function as usual. The second aspect is the elimination of the weakest. It is a genocidal policy, a necropolitics that is geared towards impoverished people, brown people, indigenous people, and people with weak health structures in general. As much as he talked about the relationship with sterilization and the birth control, and the elimination of the impoverished people, he states that all of them deserve to die. The role of the state is to let die. And it's important to realize that these two sides of the coin, neoliberalism and the necropolitics, are associated. These are not different aspects. These are two faces of the same coin. So this is it. Thank you. And sorry, I went beyond my time, and I hope I haven't exhausted you.
Muito obrigada, professor Wagner, pela partilha. Tivemos aqui falas potentes e pensamentos potentes para a gente elaborar.
We've had strong thinking, strong statements here, and we are going to have a brief pause so that we can have some water, and we'll be back in 5 minutes with Professor Evaldo to bring his considerations based on what Professor Wagner is going to state, and we are going to follow with our debate. And we will be back at 11:37. De louco.
todos, bem-vindos de volta, bem-vindas e bem-vindes. Estamos retomando aqui a nossa live de quinta-feira com os professores Roberto Wegner, professor Jacoba Banroro e o professor Antônio Evaldo, que logo entrará para fazer suas considerações. Mais uma vez, eu queria agradecer a organização do Fábrica de Ideias, agradecer a agência AGS9 por estar viabilizando esse encontro, a nossa querida tradutora, professora Raquel, e nosso querido tradutor, professor Felipe.
William,
Sim?
o meu vídeo foi parado aí por você, você tem que liberar meu vídeo.
Sim. Jordan, por gentileza, você pode liberar o vídeo do professor Evaldo? Prontinho.
Pronto.
Retomamos, o professor Evaldo vai trazer suas considerações e logo passamos para as perguntas.
Bom, serei bastante breve. Primeiro, agradecer aí as exposições, que aprendi muito, devo dizer, com o professor Jacoba Banhor, professor Robert Werner, né? Duas aulas, né, que a gente muito conectadas, e destacaria apenas algumas questões para abrir para os fabricantes, né? Primeiro, queria destacar algo que pode parecer bastante óbvio, né? Mas ao ouvir, né, as exposições, é impressionante como me parece que algumas dessas ideias e práticas que foram analisadas pelos palestrantes, né, são tão profundamente disseminadas, né, e acreditadas por diferentes setores da sociedade contemporânea, não exclusivamente pelos administradores públicos, embora estes tenham o poder de potencializar isso. Então, por exemplo, a gente escuta, né, novas formas de esterilização dos mais pobres, isso é impressionante, né? Particularmente da população não branca, né? Práticas de nacionalismo e de regionalismo xenófobos em diferentes lugares, né? Um outro elemento importante, me parece, o apagamento completo, ou quase completo, das experiências históricas da classe trabalhadora, dos mais pobres, no enfrentamento de outras doenças que exigiram, né, combate não individual, mas coletivo, e assim por diante, né? Então, para mim, me parece que, de alguma maneira, mais uma vez, nos tornamos aqui, né, laboratório de práticas violentas de racismo e de diferentes formas de desigualdade, como ficou muito claro na exposição dos dois colegas, né? Então, o primeiro ponto que eu queria destacar quer dizer, foi interessante que as duas exposições tiveram um fio condutor, um fio interpretativo interessante. Em ambos os casos, os colegas entenderam da dimensão histórica do processo, né? Não tem como compreender, né, o enfrentamento da Covid-19 e o que ocorre hoje sem fazer uma conexão com...
So what occurs today without establishing a connection between the colonial and the post-colonial, I would say, I think that the ways that the pandemic has been depicted has to do with these practices that have been established, particularly in this relationship between developed countries and in countries in development and underdeveloped that have been effectively structured through globalizations, particularly with this new racism in the 19th century that seems to be then a part of this context. And in the Brazilian context, I've read in the text that the book stated that in order to show genocidal postures of Bolsonaro, then the second point that I would like to evince in terms of the historical dimension of this analysis and the evidence, there's no way of understanding that if we focus only in specific context, though it may effectively have its specificities, and what has been said by both colleagues, Professor Jacoba Banhoro, in the sense that globalization demonstrates, it seems to me, an inequality on a global scale as we deal with combating the pandemics of coronavirus. As it's been demonstrated, if global health aims at an integration of peoples as on a global scale, seeking to change the policies of combating COVID-19 and other situations, as OMS is an essential actor in this process, but this is the clear point. How is it been occurring in the process of distributing vaccines? There's been a very unequal distribution of vaccines. As Professor Yakuba has stated, it would be paradoxical for the principles of global health to have here an abandonment of multilateralism that some rich countries, in terms of buying vaccines and its distribution. In a recent debate by Mandetta in healthcare, he stated if he did not regret having sent 1.5 million vaccines to Italy when Italy was undergoing very complicated circumstances. It seems to be something simple that emerged. So there is clearly, it seems to me, a reproduction of the division north-south, as Professor Yakuba has demonstrated in the distribution of vaccines. And there seems to be, as professors have stated, an intensification of the practices of inequalities and maintenance of an intensification of the ways of inequality. When we think about north-south divisions, Professor Yakuba has evinced, as it's been clearly stated by Professor Robert Wagner. And I would like to conclude my observations, evincing that it seems to be important that for subaltern groups and the less favored groups, it has become very evident in Africa. The impoverished ones are victims of racism in different conceptions. We have the defense or a new perspective for once again, we are being depicted as the problem. It represents that. And globally, we may also see in Africa and the Americas a continuity of these practices, the ways of dealing with the subjects that inhabit such certain spaces in cities in the global south, which once may be used and may be forgotten, so treated as non-humans or not similar to what be humans. And so finally, I think that what's frightening in this process of sterilization of impoverished women, and in Maranhão, this process was more rampant, unfortunately. And I think that another element that Professor Yakuba brought to us is that Livio also talked about that, reflections about the pandemics, this valuing or new valuing of experience of solidarity in confronting the pandemics, creating forms or new forms of solidarity. And finally, we are able to see other governments that are contrary to the implementation of healthcare policies in which people are left at their own devices. And we know there is a notion of a refusal for the intervenence of the role of the state is to let it run. So what goes against the tide of what Professor Yakubu suggests. In order to have an answer that is adequate to the COVID-19 pandemic, it's necessary to integrate a strong healthcare system with universal coverage, experiences for both groups collectively, so that we are able to have adequate answers to COVID-19. So I think that's it. I'm going to share my reflections with my colleagues. I would like to thank you once again. We already have some questions. I have two questions to Professor Banhoro, and then another question to Professor Wagner. And then we'll continue with these dynamics, the box for questions, and I'll let you know when we should wrap up the question and answer period. Professor Banhoro, Ana Costa is asking you, how do you think from a critical standpoint the role of the United Nations in this context? Would it be just a figurative role? How can we think about interventions and actions to confront the pandemics? And I would like to ask a second question. How does whiteness and institutional racism influence these institutions, global health institutions? Is it possible to assert that these global policies constitute necropolitics? And from that, I would then invite Professor Banhoro to address the questions. If Professor Robert would also like to comment, please feel free to do that. So are you going to speak French? Just wave your hand and I'll know.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to try in English.
Eu vou tentar responder essas perguntas.
Yeah, because we have a different way of speaking. I imagine it is not very convenient for the translation. So, the role of the United Nations and this divide in the world facing COVID-19. I'm not sure the United Nations can do anything, because the specialized branch of the United Nations is the World Health Organization. And the World Health Organization is intergovernmental. And if you see the evolution of the international health to global health, you can see exactly that powerful institutions and countries didn't want that less rich countries speak on their means, their money. So this is one reason to put in question the World Health Organization and its way of functioning. And it was better for one part of the world, the countries which are fortunate, and the countries, the institutions like it is United States particularly, and the World Bank, the IMF, all contribute to the budget of the World Health Organization. But if they decide to oppose the World Health Organization...
ton vidéo, s'il vous plaît. Attendez-moi. Ton vidéo, c'est... On ne veut pas ton visage.
Okay. Okay. Excuse me. I didn't know. So what I was trying to say is that I'm not sure that the United Nations can do anything in this matter. One suggestion coming from a commentator of the Lancet is that the United Nations should nominate a strong politician in order to bring people together, countries together, so that they can negotiate and have a good way of distributing the vaccines against COVID-19. So I'm not sure whether even if the United Nations nominate someone like that, he will be able to convince a great power like United Nations or I don't know, France, Germany, to enter in the World Health Organization distribution program of COVID-19 vaccines. Because there have been also critics already on the World Health Organization COVAX equality principle, so that people think, okay, it should be so that the vaccines go where it is really useful and not to distribute it to have 20% in each country and afterward to look at where it is bad to act. I think that the vaccine will be available if the production is sufficient for the powerful countries which are retracting themselves from the COVAX initiative and dealing with them themselves. If they finish to resolve the problem, maybe after that, they will act in a humanitarian way. We know what it means also to help others to acquire vaccine. So I think that people should think from themselves, because every country which cannot negotiate vaccine, which cannot buy vaccine today, or cannot help himself with other powerful countries to get the vaccine, should wait until people who are more strong can have the vaccine. So I'm not sure the United Nations can do something about that, because if you see the international relation before the global change in the World Health Organization, it was in the United Nations that countries like the United States refused to contribute, to have their contribution in the United Nations. It was to weaken the United Nations that the United States, for instance, decided to go directly in the Reagan era, to not go through the United Nations organizations to help poor countries. It will go directly in those countries to help them instead of going through the United Nations organization. Going directly in the countries means also being able to influence those countries and to be able to implement policies which are not agreed at the international stage. So I think that each country in Africa, for instance, I think that there should be a broad coalition of countries in order to open their eyes and to see in which direction they will go in the future, because COVID-19 has shown that once again, if the world come together at the World Health Organization or at the United Nations, if solutions are adopted, at one point, power countries go outside of the United Nations system and try to defend their own interest, like it was in during the primary healthcare of Alma-Ata. It was like that. It was like that in the combating against HIV/AIDS with the World Health Organization, and it is also like that in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think that the United Nations, like it's originated, it's an instrument in the hand of the powerful countries. They can deal with the United Nations if it defends their interests. They can deal with the World Health Organization if it defends their interests. But if they doesn't defend their interests, one can see that they will not go inside of the World Health Organization. And it has been so that we can see in the history of the World Health Organization, when the World Health Organization was created in 1946 until 1970s, when the Danish, after Malcolm, at the general direction of the World Health Organization, during this period, the United States have influenced through putting directors generals at the World Health Organization. World Health Organization was not a problem. It was a problem for the countries of the Soviet Union. They went away because it was dominated by the United States of America. But when this, I can say, a third world leader, after Malay, put in place the primary health care program, the United States of America didn't want to agree with that. They went out of the World Health Organization, and they put their own program in practice so that they can be able to influence the countries. So for me, I think that even if the COVID-19 vaccine will be distributed, it will have to be sufficient first for powerful countries, then it will go to powerless countries. And from that, I think that people in Africa, for instance, or elsewhere in the third country, they should think what comes next. And if they cannot put themselves to use science to develop their own economy and their own infrastructures, they don't have to tell, okay, we will count on those powerful countries to help us, because the help is always linked to the interests of the people. So this was the first question, I think. And the second question was, I should hear here.
A segunda questão foi como o professor enxerga a branquitude e o racismo.
Second question, how do you see whiteness and institutional racism as it influences these global health organizations? Is it possible to state that this is necropolitics in place? I actually would like to extend this question also to Professor Robert Wagner. Would you like me to rephrase the question?
After I have heard Professor Robert speaking about eugenism and the birth limitation and its relationship with family planning and until the disease control programs, I am inclined to think that I have not studied the question of racism in the global institutions, but I think that there is a great divide between North and South, and between powerful countries, the G7 countries, and the South part of the world. So I think that this is a divide, and everything should remain in this order. If it becomes better for the third world, it should be more better for the north, the people in the north. So I don't think that this divide is meant to be to disappear. I think in each politics, like in the health care system, we see that it is well oriented so that it can cope with the market system, so that the powerful capitalist countries can also use this emerging market to do business. And I think business is the most interesting thing in the capitalism system, and everything is done because they think, of course, that capitalism is the best way of creating richness. But it is also true that since we know capitalism, it is the cause of the roots of inequalities also in the world. And if we keep widening capitalism and deepening it everywhere in the globe, I think it is those who have the power to control the system who will always control the others also. So from that point, I cannot say, okay, it's necropolitic, but it's something like that. Thank you.
Sr. Fechner?
Bom, eu não tenho muito o que dizer depois do...
I don't have much to say after what I heard by Professor Banhoro. I don't have much to contribute in this debate about the World Health Organization. Professor Banhoro is a specialist in this debate. But I'm only going to evince one issue in this question, which is structural racism in global institutions, and if these global institutions are practicing necropolitics. I would like to draw attention to something which goes beyond, which goes along what has been said by Professor Banhoro. And currently, if we are to think in the last 5 years, more broadly in the 80s, but thinking more specifically, more recently, about the ascension of these right-wing forces all over the world. In the United States, the Donald Trump government, in Brazil, Jair, where do these attacks, the major attacks to institutions, the World Health Organization and the United Nations come to? From these right-wing parties, the extreme right-wing parties, they see in these institutions a threat to their own practices and interests. And in that sense, I would say that necropolitics is more aligned with neoliberalism and combating multilateral institutions than necropolitics being practiced by these institutions. So I would state that it has interrupted the contributions of financial funding that the United States provided to this ONU and OMS, and these right-wing institutions seek to empty these institutions that have had an important role, I would say, in combating necropolitics, in combating racism. Intellectuals that were placed in World Health Organizations are intellectuals that debate in global inequalities, North-South inequalities, and these institutions. The OMS has, the World Health Organization has been emptied by neoliberal forces since the 80s, and it's been under attack by right-wing forces in the last decade. I wanted to already gather up questions presented here. Professor Robert, what is the relationship between eugenics politics? How can you think about the concept of genocide? Since when we think about Nazism, it may not be applied to genocide as it unfolds in Brazil.
Desculpa, William, quem fez a pergunta?
O Vitor de Jesus.
Vitor. Obrigado pela questão, Vitor, muito importante.
Thank you, Vitor, for your question, a very important question. And this has to do with this debate about the continuities of eugenics in the post-World War, because in fact, we should not forget that in terms of movements, social movements and scientific movements organized effectively by the name eugenics, there has been only until the Second World War. So this notion that eugenics had the legitimacy, scientific legitimacy in the first half of the 20th century, because people state that it was a pseudoscience and so on and so forth, and it was a deviation. But actually, in the first half of the 20th century, it was indeed considered science, and it was a science that was applied, a science that should intervene in the administration and management of the population. And as I had stated, this racism was introduced in the sense of you would think you would divide the population between superior and inferior beings, and you would then have the employment of these policies in order to encourage the most able ones and discourage those considered less able. So this science, as it's been established, in fact, it is linked to a specific time period in history. And looking back in history, since the 18th, 19th century, in some countries, I would state, and in Brazil, the Latina or Latin American eugenics that valued
a eugenia não mendeliana, a eugenia que dizia que era possível melhorar a conformação biológica da população a partir de políticas higienistas, a partir da melhoria no meio ambiente, já que a melhoria em uma geração era...
Since there was this improvement of one generation would be inherited by the next, it has a strong link with eugenic theories, particularly in these countries in which it's the approach is that there would be an eugenics, such as in Brazil, in France, and in countries in Latin America in general. So this is, in thinking about eugenics, this relationship between eugenics and eugenism, and thinking about the context of the Second World War, is to think about the continuities of notions and practices that were spread in the medical sciences, for example. The medical sciences geared towards medical. There's many eugenic elements in eugenic medicine, but it's not the reproduction of it as we would see during the war. these organizations that existed in the United States that proposed the birth control in impoverished countries was not exactly the reproduction of eugenics, but the concept of it is important for us to think critically about these processes, and at the same time, we should not simplify it to think about eugenics, whether it continues or not. And I'm more concerned to think about, as Evaldo has stated, I'm more concerned about the rearticulation and renewal of articulations and renewals, new formats of racism in Brazil and in the world. So this is my point. It's better to think about these issues from the notion of racism itself, or whether eugenics continues to be a practice or not. Thank you, Professor Wagner. We have two issues here that I would like to, I'll ask them together. Rafael, would you like to ask you, Professor Banhoro? How do you interpret, in the context of the current pandemic, the presence of actors such as Russia, China, and the European Union in defining these policies, sanitary policies, in the context of health policies? Is it possible to think about international cooperation that are not trapped into the logic of the United States, for example, in these large powers, these big powers, thinking about beyond the World Health Organization and its relationship with Africa? Do you see forms of neo-colonialism and imperialism in these relationships? New forms of colonialism and imperialism in these relationships?
Thank you for the question. I think that we are in a world where, if you want to survive, you should try to become strong and stronger. I think Russia and China in this politic, they may be able to have influence against the domination of American and European, but given the fact that they are embarked in the same system, this is capitalism. I think that we can see quickly a kind of another new colonialism in in Russian politics and in China's politics, because it is the same logic. I think that China has become really a powerful country, not only because it wanted to become so powerful, but because it wanted also to be able to dominate some powerful countries and to dominate also the world in order to be able to survive. And I cannot see that they won't act like the United States and Russia as well. Thank you.
Obrigada, professor. Eu vou passar de novo para o professor Robert Wagner, que a Elizabeth, eu vou juntar as perguntas pelo caminhar do tempo.
This is a question to Professor Wagner. Let's see if we're able to finish at 12:30, because sometimes online events tend to be complicated. So let's move forward. Elizabeth Vieira has asked Professor Robert, from the readings, it seems in your explanations, what are the possible strategies against death policies in Brazil? And then I'm going to bring some questions, also some points that were raised. She states it's a war when there's an absence of leadership and political pressure to invert this logic of genocide and capitalism. We may state that neoliberal policies and necropolitics has found a fertile ground in the absence of strong social movements and scientific fields or scientific realms that are in a state of inertia, if you will. Thank you for your questions. I share your concerns. I don't have an answer per se. And I remember the beginning of Evaldo's when he stated that something that we live is a worldwide tragedy. We look at France, how the right-wing military forces positioning against Arabs and Muslims, the situation in which we have the expansion of right-wing forces and necropolitics and racism is spread all over the world. And in Brazil, we've lived this tragedy under the Bolsonaro government. But what concerns us is what Evaldo has brought to us, and the notion that it's necessary to sterilize the most impoverished ones, the notion that the state must be absent, and that this fascination by entrepreneurship, that we will be able to bring ourselves by our bootstraps, it's something that is highly concerning. And that on the other hand, and that's it, we, in this situation of social isolation, of going into the streets and getting organized and so on, it only complicates the situations we are living in. I only hope that along the lines of what had been stated, the hope that workers are organized. And this is what is the hopes that I have in Paraisópolis. In São Paulo, there's been that they have organized themselves. In Rio, we are completing 1 week of a massacre that took place, 1 week of this genocide that was practiced in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Since with Witzel and now with Castro, it hasn't changed anything. There's one police intervention every 5 days in Rio. So what happened in Jacarezinho was not an isolated situation. So it is, in fact, what we are living now is a genocide, a massacre promoted by the state in Rio de Janeiro, that a state that has been taken over by militias. So we are at a very difficult juncture. And the only answer I have is that I have the hopes that we will be able to reorganize ourselves in order to stop this tragedy, this ongoing tragedy in Brazil and in Rio de Janeiro, a state that is completely taken over by the militias. The police is no longer able to control the state, and we know that there are deep links between militia forces and the police. So my question is more in the hopes that we will be able to reorganize ourselves than a more concrete answer. And I share your concerns. So let's hope then. It's been so very difficult, the practices of having hope. And I only to just point a question that was brought by Anna. She talked about inertia, and that several movements since the beginning of the pandemic state, many articulations have been made with social movements. They have never stopped and they are ongoing. But I think that the regime of visibility that these social movements have in perspective, local perspective, national perspective. And so I don't think that there was inertia. I think that these interventions are territorialized and sometimes they don't reach the knowledge of everybody. And in order to wrap up, I would like to bring a question that was placed by Angelo about, Angelo states that about the theories of modernity that are reflected in the first international conference that joined former colonized and colonizers in 72. And he would like to know if these theories of modernity may be reflected in this international conference in which colonizers and former colonized and colonizers were gathered up in Stockholm, please.
Professor?
Alô? Professores?
Professor Banhoro, would you like to address that question first? Yes.
So, if I have understood well, it is the situation in those organizations where we have former colonizers and colonized people. So I think this is a very good question, because what made United Nations very important for the former colonized countries was that they could meet themselves in the United Nations, and they could also defend themselves in the face of the world, and to ask for more social justice, and not only to allow the development to be taken to take place in North countries. I think there was a great debate in the 70s where the people in the South were looking for a new economic order in the United Nations. And it was not successful, but it was turned around, and there have been structures which have been put in place in order to satisfy the third world countries. But it was not meant for development in reality, but because I think the dilemma of developing third world countries, if you see the programs, they don't help so that the countries can develop themselves and make a big concurrence to the helpers, they help in order to maintain the people who are seeking for help at a certain level. If you look at the climate change market and the carbon market, it's something like that. But I would like to also underline the fact that the countries in the third world were free, mostly in Africa in the 60s. And the fact that they came into the World Health Organization a lot, they were able to dominate because the World Health Organization was an intergovernmentalist organization. That means that each state has one voice. Because the poor countries were most numerous in the World Health Organization, they were able to vote for programs that could strengthen the health system. But this is also why big countries, rich countries like the United States and institutions that they control didn't want that to stay in this kind of intergovernmentalist organization, because they have the power and the money, and those who have the voices in the World Health Organization should decide. And they have broken this system so that they can decide on their own means. If you look at the primary health care, for instance, it was those who have to give their fair share in order to be able to carry out this program, they refuse to pay. And they put in place another program in which they have put help with money so that this program can develop itself without strengthening healthcare system. And they have put the money aside. And this is also the case when the World Health Organization, seeing that the HIV politics was a big deal in the inside of the United Nations, inside of the World Health Organization, and there was a lot of money for HIV/AIDS, but the staff of the World Health Organization could not use the money for another thing than for the HIV/AIDS politics, which was sustained by rich countries. And in 88, for instance, the World Health Organization decided to decentralize the AIDS policies to integrate the AIDS policies inside of the primary healthcare facilities, so that the money can go there in the primary healthcare program and can help also to strengthen the system, the healthcare system. But the same powerful countries and institutions refused and rejected that, and they retained the money. They didn't want that it goes to strengthen to the primary healthcare system. So this was one reason why they have created the United AIDS, the United AIDS Organization. This is why they have created it, in order to be able to leave the intergovernmental organization, the World Health Organization, to be aside and to be able to decide where the money should go. And as they have seen that the UNAIDS was also surrounded with a lot of social movement organization, and they was asking for more money to deal with HIV, the AIDS. So Peter Pugh himself, the former director of the unit, said that it was really difficult when they were asking money. And he was receiving call from powerful countries to say him not to ask for money to provide HIV/AIDS medicine to people. So I think that this was also the reason why the G7 created the Global Fund in another form. It was not inside of the United Nations, so that those who want to put the money there, they can put their money and they can decide where the money should go. That means they masters the way where the money can be spent, and not spend it as the people want in countries that it be spent. So I think that there is this since the third world countries have come a lot in the World Health Organization, there was a problem for powerful countries because the countries were numerous to be able to reverse the decisions of the powerful countries. And this is in which we are still going now. Thank you.
Obrigada, professor Jacoba. Então, estamos aqui finalizando o nosso quarto encontro do ciclo de lives. Retornaremos na terça-feira.
Concluding then our fourth debate in the second group of lives. We have now on Tuesday, we are going to have a follow-up to this meeting with Professor Angela Figueiredo, debating utopias and pandemics in the United States. I would like to thank Professor Banhoro, Professor Evaldo, Professor Wagner. I would like to thank Professor Raquel and Felipe for the interpretation, and for those of you who have followed us, thank you for your participation, and let's in which we ponder about this drastic moment. I would like to also thank AGS 9. Thank you. Have a great weekend. Stay safe, and let's continue to have hope. Thank you.